Trump is much more, or should we say, is he much more nativist, or much more make America first policy strategist. Biden still saw multilateralism, at least or plurilateralism, where a cluster of friendly countries working together in trade could still be a policy. It is less clear whether Trump necessarily takes that point of view.
Welcome to Strat News Global. I'm Surya Gangadharan. You're on the gist, and my guest is Pramit Pal Chaudhuri, head of India practice of the Eurasia Group, political risk consultancy based in the US. Pramit Pal Chaudhuri, glad to have you. We are looking at the US elections. Donald Trump's inauguration is only a couple of days away. Pramit and I are going to talk about the strategic issues concerning India and the US. And this is something that Pramit has been tracking closely for a long time. Pramit, glad to have you. My first question: what's that big difference you see between the incoming Trump administration and the outgoing one?
I would argue that the broad strategic thinking of both governments will be more or less the same. Biden, Trump, and to some degree Obama all had a common recognition or belief that America was overstretched, suffering from imperial overstretch, had to reduce its commitments around the world to some basic core areas. And if you saw the interim national security guidelines issued by the Biden administration in its second year, and if you look at the speeches and comments made by virtually everybody in Trump's inner circle on foreign policy, including Trump himself, it's basically we reduce our commitments as much as possible, America does. But the heart of the most important commitment that remains is the Indo-Pacific. Because China is America's primary strategic threat and rival. There is no difference, I think, between Biden and Trump on that front. Um, there is a bit of wavering, obviously, between Trump and Biden on Russia, but they both agree that the Ukraine war has to end in a manner, if you wish, that gives uh, some withdrawal by Russia of some variety. Um, Trump is more skeptical of the Atlantic Alliance than Biden is. Biden is very much a World War II, Cold War generation. Trump is not opposed to NATO, but he says he doesn't feel the Europeans are pulling their weight. Something Biden has also complained about, but is not as vociferous as Trump is.
Mhm.
Both of them feel America is overextended in the Middle East and would like to reduce their commitments there, but accept that stability of the Middle East is still something America has to be concerned about. But Trump is much more hostile to Iran than, for example, Biden was, who did attempt at one point at least to resurrect a nuclear deal between the U.S. and Iran. Um, where I think the big difference is on the secondary issues of the strategic of policy. Biden, being a Democrat, had a left wing within his own party, where he's still very focused on human rights. Biden
Mhm.
genuinely believes in this autocracy versus democracy argument, something he often enunciated. But he had to accommodate these human rights issues, groups and activists, because they are a key part of the Democratic Party. And that resulted, of course, in run ins, for example, with countries like India, the entire issue of supposed democratic backsliding, concerns about the Sheikh Hasina's government in Bangladesh. These are not issues that the Trump administration, in fact, most Republicans don't care about at all. They're much more
Mhm.
realpolitik individuals, and they are totally unconcerned. We didn't see the Trump 1.0 raise these issues. We will not see that being raised a second time in this administration.
Mhm.
In addition, but one area where there is a huge difference is trade. I'd say a huge
Mhm.
difference. Uh, Biden more or less supported the multilateral trading organization, but agreed with the original Trump administration that it was no longer functioning the way it should. Um, so both of them, for example, effectively neutered the World Trade Organization by disallowing a tribunal structure to work. Both of them
Mhm.
launched industrial policies that America must focus on building certain capacities and then re-establishing certain manufacture. And both of them are very focused on safe and secure supply chains, and where India fits in perfectly for the most part. But Trump is much more, or should we say, is he much more nativist, or much more make America first policy strategist. Biden still saw multilateralism, at least in a, or plurilateralism, where a cluster of friendly countries working together in trade could still be a
Mhm.
policy. It is less clear whether Trump necessarily takes that point of view.
Mhm. Do you expect Trump, given the fact that he's threatened 60% tariffs on the Chinese, do you expect him to do some kind of a review of the previous administration of his first term when those tariffs were first applied? And given how China appears to have circumvented them, setting up factories in Mexico to take advantage of the free trade agreement there?
So, yes, we expect some kind of action. We'll see. I think the Wall Street Journal ran an article yesterday where it said very clearly that Trump plans to launch tariffs across the board. Even in India, we should expect to be hit by some of them. We were in the first Trump administration, not directly. He just issued broad tariffs against the entire steel, all steel imports, which included those from India, um, steel and aluminium. So we were affected. We retaliated. Uh, but we will expect that action. The question is, who does he hit, and what will be the tariff structure in each case? We don't have a clear idea, but yes, he's threatened 60% tariffs. In some interviews, he said 1,000% tariffs against China. It seems the number is
Yeah.
quite arbitrary. But we expect the worst tariff strictures to be hit against China. China has promised retaliation, in other words, by basically devaluing the yuan. That is a concern to India because that would mean the world will be flooded with very, very cheap, even cheaper Chinese products, which will be a huge disruption
Mhm.
both to our trade as well as to our domestic industry. But that's true for all emerging economies. So we will see a huge
Yeah.
tariff response across the world in response to the US China fighting with each other. In India's case, he's only spoken about a 20% tariff um,
Yeah.
on, on certain goods. But keep in mind that since he's been elected, though he's had one or two comments, he's criticized every country on tariffs. He's only once or twice raised India, and in the hit list that has been leaked to the press so far, India doesn't factor in on the top 10. So I don't think
Okay.
we're a priority. So, but we will
Mhm.
see some tariffs to hit us, I think, in the sense that, let's say, steel and aluminium may come back. Um, and we may see tariffs, but it's very clear, as the outgoing US Ambassador Eric Garcetti has said, but also the emissaries that Trump has already sent to India have all said the
Yeah.
same thing. This is an opening gambit for a conversation about a larger trade and technology agreement between the two countries. In other words,
Mhm.
tariffs are not an end in themselves. They're just Trump's slightly unusual way of catching your attention and saying you and I need to now talk about trade seriously. But
Mhm.
that's not necessarily the case with China, because in China they tried that in Trump 1.0. Remember, the Chinese had agreed to buy, I think it was $200 billion worth of American
Yeah.
products in return
Yeah.
for tariff reduction. They never bought those. That in fact, quite the opposite. They said we will no
Yeah.
longer buy Boeing aircraft, and so on and so forth. So Trump will go into the China story with a great degree of distrust that we tried this once before. You never
Mhm.
fulfilled your side of the agreement.
Okay. Given the fact that Trump is pushing, make America great again, trying to rebuild the entire industrial, especially in key sectors like semiconductors and so on, could that affect the India story where we are trying to do much the same, start building, making
Right.
chips here and so on?
I mean, keep in mind where we are with chips right now is very, very far down the
Nascent,
ladder.
nascent.
Nathan,
True.
I mean, we have presently one fab under plan construction, three chip assembly plants. We are focusing on chip design, which is something we already do in conjunction with the United States. We dominate chip design. But we are many miles away before we have to worry about somehow in any way
Hmm.
infringing on the United States. And keep in mind that the chips we are looking at right now, starting from zero, so it's still an
Yeah.
accomplishment, are in the sort of 40 to 80 nanometer, 100 nanometer level, which is, really old technology, but perfect for our industry. Our
Yeah.
industry requirements, automobiles, heavy engineering, electrical appliances. That's the kind of chip we need. So it secures our domestic supply chain. The idea is over time, obviously, we change that. Um, while America is looking at can they hit the 5 nanometer, 3 nanometer, 2 nanometer chip area, basically
Yeah.
where Taiwan already is and Japan already is. So we're on two very different tracks on that front. I think so. I'm not too worried about the chip side. In many ways, I think the Americans don't want to build the kind of chips we want to build. So
Okay.
we can actually continue on our path without having to infringe, if you wish, on the United States or vice versa. I think the bigger concern will be if you look at what the Biden administration had agreed with the Modi government when they met in Wilmington, Delaware in the last summit, bilateral summit.
Yeah.
America basically said, "Look, we want safe and secure supply chains, not just for semiconductors, but also for green technology, solar wafers, so on and so forth. For pharmaceuticals, a big issue with the
Yeah.
Americans because of the amount of fentanyl and drug stuff that they get from into China, which is causing an
Crisis.
opioid
Yeah.
addiction problem, and which China uses for leverage with them, where they have to sort of beg the Chinese stop producing the stuff or control the export. China says, "Well, in return, you've got to give us X, Y, and Z," which infuriates the Americans, obviously. So you saw the Americans come out with these proposals under Biden, and Biden basically said, to some degree, America would even subsidize this by giving contracts to Indian companies to help build this stuff. The
Okay.
question for me now is and we had the military chip program announced that they would build, an Indian fab, fab would be built in India with Indian chip design companies and startups with the idea of supplying chips to the US Space Force. So in effect, America would buy the chips, provide the contract, and in effect subsidize, if you wish, production in India.
Yeah.
Now, that was Biden. Will Trump be prepared to support something like that? In the sense, would he say, yeah, well, I think maybe, why do we make it in America? Why are we giving it to India? I don't mind the Indians,
Yeah.
but I'm an America First president. So we have to see uh, how much the strategic thinking of the long term strategic idea of interlinking, which Biden put forward and we agreed to, of interlinking supply chains between India and the US in certain
Mhm.
strategic areas. How much of that will override the America First tendencies of the Trump administration? So that's something we'll have to see. And I think our foreign minister in Australia, I believe it was, recently had said we have to assume that the incoming administration will be less generous. They will be
Mhm.
strategically aligned with India, but maybe less generous than the present one. We'll have to see where that goes. We don't know yet.
Mhm. There's this aircraft engine deal
Correct.
for the GE engine for the fighter aircraft. It's been delayed already. You expect any impact on that?
No, I don't expect it. I think that'll actually go through now. Because the main reason I gather that it had been impacted earlier, slowed down, was that one of the key component manufacturers, a South Korean firm, had gone bankrupt. And
Yeah.
so then the GE guys, and the GE was also splitting internally. They were dividing into two companies. And that
Mhm.
combination delayed that process. But this was something that had begun, if I remember correctly, negotiations had actually begun under Trump 1.0, first administration. And so I don't see that a problem. And remember that ultimately, that's not an engine technology that America is concerned about because they've gone well
Yeah.
beyond the 414. So for them, this is a perfect story. about both helping India develop an indigenous defense capacity, which they support,
Hmm.
but second, also weaning us off of Russia, which they would very much
Of
like to
Russia.
do. So the combination
Hmm.
of that two will be, I think, sufficient for that to go through. It is a contract we will pay money for a lot of that. We'll develop some capacities along the way. But for America, it makes no sense for them to change that policy. If anything, I would expect Trump to also come at some point and say, why don't we allow them to buy better technology? Why don't we allow them to consider an F-35 or something? I mean, what is
Hmm.
striking about Trump's team, Mike Waltz, the NSA designate, Mark Rubio, the Secretary of State designate, both of them have come out in public as senators saying that Quad members, and India in particular, should be treated the same as NATO members. We don't understand why there's a discrimination.
Hmm.
Um, so they clearly, I mean, at least those two members, we don't know about the others, of the national security structure that Trump will be bringing in, will say, we have a legal thing that one is a military ally and non-military ally, but hey, as somebody once in America said, Thailand is a U.S. military ally because of the Cold War. But America will not fight for Thailand. Thailand is not going to fight for the United States. India is much more important
Hmm.
geopolitically to America today than Thailand is. But because we have this Cold War legacy of treaty allies and a legal system built around it, we have this nonsense, but it doesn't make any sense. Um,
Hmm.
so I will be curious, but I have a suspicion we'll see that people like Waltz and Rubio will be prepared to come out and say, we need to stop making this distinction of between India and other legacy allies. This is a stupid difference.
Hmm.
And we need to begin that making that progress. And that would be a great move because that right now we have this constant legal battle of running into lawyers in the American system saying, yeah, we'd like to give India this technology, but it's not a military ally, and our laws are only military allies get this technology.
Yeah.
And they'll say,
Hmm.
yeah, but these are countries that, what does it matter? So that's the law. We're going to change. You want to change the law? You change the law. But otherwise, we can't allow this.
Hmm. What about an area like space or even clean energy? What do you any changes you see here?
So space is definitely, we're already working closely together. The
Yeah.
military chip project that I'd mentioned is selling to the US Space Force. We have opened up our space sector to the private sector, very clearly not going to be working with the Chinese or the Russians.
Yeah.
What we're seeing in international space right now, the international space station we have upstairs in the sky right now, that's the last international space station, genuinely international. Because what's
Yeah.
happening is that the Russia-China space program is, you will have a set of countries building themselves around the Russia-China program. You're having
Hmm.
another set of countries signing the Artemis Accord, which effectively ties you to the American or the Western space program. India has signed the Artemis Accord. We may not have a problem with the Russians, but we definitely not can't work with the Chinese. So
Yeah.
therefore, so you're going to see the international space program or international space program develop
Diverging.
into two
Hmm.
sectors, and we are very clearly going with the US one, the Artemis Accord one. So already, I was talking the other day to a company called Axum Space in America, who are building the manned space capsules for the future of the American space program, right?
Hmm.
And they said the instant you guys signed the Artemis Accord, we got a call from the White House or in Washington saying every single one of your capsules, which carry over X number of astronauts, one of those seats is designated for India. In fact, one seat for every Quad member, right?
I see.
Because
Okay.
now there's going to be a Quad-based space program project. In fact, the Europeans, it's not clear they're getting a seat, I should add, right? The Europeans have
Hmm.
asked for one, but they said we haven't got a clearance on that yet. Um, so you are sitting there. So now, and you may have heard the announcement that two Indian astronauts two
Yeah.
Indians have been sent to Houston for training for exactly that purpose. So you're starting to see, and that's just on the manned program. Across the board, you're going to see our space programs merge increasingly with those of Japan, the United States, especially our private sector space. As
Hmm.
it builds up steam, we'll see more and more investment coming in on that front from the West because we will not allow Chinese investment. It's as simple as that.
What about clean energy?
So
Or is
clean
that a
energy is
bad
a bit
word
more
with the
complicated.
Trump administration?
So the game with Trump, from what I remember in his first administration, as his then ambassador Ken Juster told me, he said, "Look, Trump is allergic to the word climate, but he
Hmm.
is not allergic to the word solar power or wind power, right? Or whatever, nuclear reactors. So if you phrase it correctly, he
Hmm.
won't have a problem with it. So the game is to not say climate." Now, Modi got this very sensibly. So when he, for example, met President Bolsonaro, who was then president of Brazil,
Yeah.
Bolsonaro was also violently climate denialist. But Bolsonaro came to India. What did he do? He signed a bilateral agreement on biofuels, a bilateral agreement on
Yeah.
solar power, a bilateral agreement on wind, a
Yeah.
bilateral agreement on everything, renewable energy. The word climate carefully excluded from the whole thing, but Bolsonaro happily signed on board. Right?
Hmm.
Nobody is against solar power, but the ideology of climate in the view of the right wing in the West is unacceptable. So the game for us will be to work with the Americans without saying the word climate. And that's perfectly feasible, right? That's not a problem.
Yeah. Yeah.
The
Absolutely.
problem that we will face is that right now, especially in solar, which is where India is doing the biggest strides, we are wildly dependent on Chinese components. So is the United States. And that was what Biden began the process. How can we build safe and secure supply chains, which we exclude the Chinese? Most of those areas we can do it once we get enough scale. I think the big problem is solar wafers, where China's domination is massive, 90%. And when
Hmm.
India has tried to enter that space, we have found that the problem is that the capital equipment, the capital goods required to make solar wafers are also Chinese. China does not allow
Hmm.
the export of those machinery to India, so they know where the threat is. So we're going to have
Yeah.
to work a way to get around that. And there we need help of countries like America. We need to work together to generate an entire parallel capital goods infrastructure that allows us to get around this Chinese block on solar wafers. If we get through the solar wafers, solar is not a problem in my view anymore. The second element will be critical minerals for batteries in particular and storage.
Yeah.
There, I think the Australians will probably be the country that we're working closest with. Rare earths are not rare. They're also not rare. I don't know why they're called rare earths. But anyway, whatever else, they are there. The processing of that stuff is controlled by China, not the mining. There are a lot of people mine this stuff. Processing is needed, and that's where we, unfortunately, India mining and processing is environmentally extraordinarily difficult to get through our laws and our Supreme Court and our state governments. So we need alliances. I think Australia probably is the forefront on that. But again, it's something we can easily work with the Americans. And then finally, we move on to green hydrogen. There, we'll have to see because the Americans have been, even under Biden, have been a bit. Do they go down the LNG plus carbon sequestration path, or do they go down the green hydrogen path? Not clear with the United
Yeah.
States. The country that is definitely a leader there is green hydrogen is Japan, and there I think is where we may have to work. But again, it's something America has elements that they can contribute to.
Last question. As in space, do you see a hardening of the internet world also into two separate
Yeah.
spheres?
And I think there we're going to have to see how our digital policies come along. But there, you know, when people say, "What does Trump want from us if he imposes after he imposes tariffs?" I think if you go back to Trump 1.0 in 2020, the then USTR, Bob Lighthizer, told the Indian side, I think it was January 2020, "Look, we're imposing the tariffs. Don't worry about that. We want
Mhm.
essentially the equivalent of an FTA with you. But the FTA of the future, of the 21st century, is not going to be about, it can be, we have to do little blueberries and the cheese and all that stuff. That's fine. But the real future is going to be digital, it's going to be
Yeah.
technology." So he had proposed a 5 point digital dialogue agenda: e commerce, cross border data flow, data privacy, so on and so forth. But we had the two governments had agreed to meet in April, but COVID happened in between, and that was never the meeting never took place. My
Yeah.
expectation is Trump is going to come in and say, "We pick up from where we left off in January 2020, but now we incorporate a whole bunch of technologies." So what you'll be looking at is a big trade and technology economic agreement. That may include labor mobility, investment, but a whole bunch of technologies, because that's what the Quad is all about. It's a strategic
Yeah.
technology coalition, because that's the future of 21st century geopolitics is technology. That's what the Chinese have fully understood. That aircraft carriers and stuff is fine, but the real beating heart of American power is the fact that it's dominated technology since the 1950s. China's game is we replicate that, all you countries are going to come and bow to us, even without us having to fire a shot, because you'll all have to come to us. And technology, data technology, digital technology, cross-border data flow, where does that go? Which countries do you allow your private data to flow to is going to be
Yeah.
crucial. And that division is slowly taking place. I go to Hong Kong uh, on behalf of my company for conferences and so on. And it's really difficult to use a taxi there because they don't allow Google Pay. They don't allow Apple Pay in Hong Kong anymore. RUPay, obviously, and UPI doesn't exist. We in India do
Mhm.
not allow Alipay or any of the
Yeah.
Chinese ones. So our phones don't have that. So I go into a
Yeah.
cab, right? And a lot of cabs in Hong Kong don't use credit cards. So you end up having to pay cash. There's almost no other way to function. So it's a huge issue, but it's a sign of the future that if a financial center like Hong Kong, you no longer are able to find a fintech structure that is compatible or acceptable to that government of Hong Kong, that's going to spread in the future, and we're going to have this problem. It's very clear where India
Mhm.
is going. We allow the Western systems; they allow ours. None of us are allowing the Chinese.
Mhm. And finally, still looking at the future, you expect anything on the nuclear front now that those BRC and BEML have been removed from the entities list?
Let's put it this way: it's opening. It's the first of a set of steps that are required if we are able to cooperate in private nuclear and particularly in small modular reactor technology, which is going to
Yeah.
be,
Yeah.
we hope to be solving our problem on so-called baseload power. Um, the, the thing is, that's a first step. That essentially fulfills a requirement, I think, of our Department of Atomic Energy, that how can we work with the Americans if they sanction our institutions? So the Americans accept that's true, so they've lifted that. But after that, we still have India's internal, our very flawed liability, civil liability, nuclear liability bill.
Yeah. Yeah.
We will effectively, Western companies have to set up in India, become vendors to be exempted from that liability bill. Some of them will say, but then we have IP nuclear tech issues. Are we allowed to transfer that technology into Indian
Yeah.
soil? Which then again runs into American laws. So there's a whole set of problems that have to be worked out on that front. But this is the first step towards it. The question is, you have to put in a lot of political will to force, whether it's DAE on the Indian side or the equivalent American nuclear non-proliferation structures on their side to be changed. If it happens, that's great, because we've run into the same wall with the Japanese, who are one of the leaders in technology,
Yeah.
civilian technology. They have the same problem. They said, you guys don't fulfill our laws. Um, and the Japanese have been unable to change theirs. So we really need to figure out if we can do the same, get the Europeans, the Americans to make that change, those changes.
Pramit, great talking to you. And all
My
eyes
pleasure.
post the inauguration to see what rolls out.
Yes.
Great perspective and insight, Pramit. Thanks very much. Great
Thank
talking
you.
to you.
Great. Bye.
That's all we have for you on this broadcast. Do subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us on social media. Thank you very much. Good day.